Hi, I'm David Hunter, and today I have a demand and supply question for you. First, we're going to find the equilibrium price and quantity. Then we're going to do economic welfare analysis, which is finding consumer and producer surplus. Then we're going to ask what happens if there's a price ceiling imposed by the government of $150. What's the new equilibrium? And what is the new consumer and producer surplus that results from that price ceiling? So we'll start by looking at the demand curve and the supply curve. And at equilibrium, the normal equilibrium condition is that quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. But because these are inverse demand curves with price on the left-hand side, you can also use the equivalent equilibrium condition that the price consumers are willing to pay, that's PD, that's the price from the demand curve, is equal to the price from the supply curve, which is the price suppliers are willing to receive. And in that case, the equilibrium condition is 500 minus 4Q. That's the demand curve is equal to 100 plus Q. If we bring the quantity over to the right-hand side and the 100 to the left-hand side, we get 400 equals 5Q. And so we divide through by 5 to get the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. So at the initial equilibrium, P is 180 and Q is 80. Now let's show the answer graphically. So we'll have the price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. 500 was the intercept for the demand curve. So we draw the 500 and a downward sloping line for a demand curve. 100 was the intercept for the supply curve. So we'll have an upward sloping supply curve. And the intersection gives us 180 for the price and Q equals 80 for the quantity. Now let's calculate the consumer and producer surplus. Here again are the demand and supply curves. And from our graph from the previous slide, we have the demand curve and the supply curve. Notice that it's very important to indicate the intercepts for the demand and supply curve. And that's because the equilibrium price and quantity create two triangles which represent consumer and producer surplus. In particular, the consumer surplus is the benefit to consumers because they're willing to pay a high price according to the demand curve, but they actually only pay $180. So the difference between the price they're willing to pay and the price they actually pay, that's consumer surplus. Now you can see that's a triangle. It's 1/2 base times height. 500 minus 180, you can think of that as a base, times the height of 80, and that is 12,800. For producer surplus, that's the difference between the price producers actually receive, which is 180, and the price that they're willing to sell at, which is the low price given by the supply curve. So the producer surplus is the difference between the price that they actually receive and the price at which they'd actually be willing to sell at. And that again is the area between 180 and the supply curve. That's another triangle. So producer surplus is 1/2 base times height. Now it's 180 minus 100 is the base times 80 the height. And that gives us 3,200. If we add together the consumer and producer surplus, you get the total surplus. And so doing that gives us a total surplus of 16,000. And that will allow us to make a comparison between the perfect competition case, which is this initial equilibrium, and when the government institutes a price ceiling, and we can make a comparison to see if there's increase or decrease in total surplus. Now let's see what happens when there's a price ceiling. In particular, we draw in the supply and demand curves. Here's our initial equilibrium. The price ceiling is $150. That's going to generate an excess demand for goods. You can see that immediately on the graph. The $150, that's the red price ceiling. If we look at that, we can see that the quantity demanded is going to be very high because at 150, that's a low price. Consumers are willing to pay for 87.5 units. That's the quantity demanded. Quantity supplied, on the other hand, we'll plug in 150 into the supply curve, and we get the quantity supplied is only 50. Because the price is so low, producers are not willing to sell as much. Now the difference, that's the excess demand for goods. That's a 37.5 unit shortage. And that you can see is the horizontal distance between the quantity demanded, 87.5, and the quantity supplied of 50. Now, who gets hurt and who benefits from this price ceiling? Now, the consumers that are actually able to get their hands on drugs at the low price are made better off. But you can also see that there's consumers that want to buy the drugs at 150 but cannot get drugs at 150. Those are consumers that are made worse off. Of course, producers, because they are selling less at a lower price, are made worse off unambiguously. Now, in the long run, what happens? Well, because the price falls, that's going to hurt profits. In the long run, firms can exit or enter, and if there's profits that are falling, well, firms will exit. That will shift the supply curve to the left, which will lead to even greater shortages. So on the last slide, we already talked about who is benefited by the price ceiling and who gets hurt. Let's calculate consumer and producer surplus explicitly now. So here we have the graph again, and there's the price ceiling of 150. Now we said that the quantity supplied when P was 150 was 50. In order to figure out consumer and producer surplus, we first have to figure out what is the price when Q is equal to 50. We can do that very easily by plugging in Q equals 50 into the demand equation, and we get the corresponding price is 300. So in other words, when the price is 300, quantity demanded is 50. Now that breaks up the graph into a couple of different regions, A, B, C, and E. And if you look at it, the consumer surplus is going to be regions A and B, the producer surplus is region C, and E is what's going to be known as the deadweight loss or the inefficiency of the price ceiling. Okay, so now let's calculate the actual numbers. We said that consumer surplus was regions A and B. And so A is the upper triangle. So again, we have 1/2 base times height. B was the rectangle below that upper triangle. And here you have the numbers. You can double check for yourself that those are the correct numbers. And so we get that the total consumer surplus is now 12,500. Producer surplus was region C. And again, that's a triangle, so we have 1/2 base times height. And if you plug in those numbers, we get 1,250. We can add those two surpluses together to get the total surplus after the price ceiling, which is now 13,750. If you recall that the initial total surplus was 16,000, so the price ceiling causes total surplus to fall, which means that the price ceiling is inefficient. Indeed, the deadweight loss then would be 2,250, and we can actually also calculate that explicitly as region E, but I'll leave that for you as an exercise. I hope you found this helpful. Take care. Bye.